Jeannie Long, Executive Director of Chicago Collections Consortium, and thank you for joining us tonight for our program, Chicago Cultural Changemakers. For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, Chicago Collections is a consortium of over 60 museums, libraries, and cultural organizations, all working together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago's history and culture. We do this through our cornerstone initiative, Explore Chicago Collections Portal. And we invite you to check out us on our website at chicagocollections.org to learn more. And for those of you who are returning, welcome back. We'd like to acknowledge the Tara Foundation of American Art for their generous support of tonight's program, which is being presented as part of Art Design Chicago Now, an initiative funded by the Tara Foundation for American Art, which amplifies the voices of Chicago's diverse creatives, past and present, and explores the essential roles they play in shaping the now. Please check out Tara's website for additional information on their programs and events. We hope to see you at our November 11th event, our conversation with Crate and Barrel founder Gordon Siegel, which is another program being held in partnership with Art Design Chicago Initiative. Tonight, Chicago Collections is proud to partner with our moderator, Tanner Woodford. Tanner is the founder and executive director of the Design Museum of Chicago. Tanner will be in conversation with our panelists, Paulo Aguirre, founder of Borderless, George A., co-founder and director of innovation for Greater Good Studio, and Chris Rudd, founder and CEO of Shy by Design. Thank you to our panelists. And now, Tanner, let's begin our discussion.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and feel like I'm sitting amongst some giants of Chicago's sort of cultural scene. It does feel like a bit of a reunion as well. Paula said that earlier, but I'm thrilled to introduce you to everybody if you don't know them. Everybody has a couple of slides. So we'll start by, I'll introduce each panelist and then review some slides really quickly. And then we'll get into some questions. Planning on keeping it very casual. If you have any questions as we're talking, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. And then we will do a Q&A at the end of the event here. So we can come back to them then. So without further ado, I'm going to start with you, Paula. Paula Aguirre Serrano is founder of Borderless, an urban design and research consultancy focused on collaborative and interdisciplinary projects. With emphasis on research and communication across disciplines, Borderless explores comprehensive design solutions that address urban systems and city design by looking at intersections between architecture, urban design, infrastructure, landscape, and participatory processes. So Paula, do you want to walk us through your slides you've got here in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I truly feel among friends and people that I admire in this field, design that brings us all together and passionate about our communities. Can we go to the next slide, please? So at Borderless, I founded Borderless in 2016, really thinking of how do I bring my design background, my research interests, my passion about working with communities into one realm. And therefore, thinking about how do we transcend or really propose and push boundaries, not only between territories. I love mapping. I'm going to talk about space in a moment, but really thinking about removing those boundaries across fields of practice, of discipline. So like Tanner mentioned, our work spans everything from civic arts, infrastructure, urban design, architecture, planning, landscape. So we really try to embrace a lot of the facets of the built environment. This is one of our most known pieces. This is a map of Chicago at large scale that we really try to think between research and interaction. This map is meant to be a call for attention about a research that we've been doing for a number of years about closed schools in Chicago, the largest school closure in the country that happened in 2013. And we wanted to think about another way to put forward this issue in a city like Chicago and really imagine what is the future of social infrastructure together. Can we go to the next one? That previous map it's actually painted on as a design installation in one of the closed schools that it's located in the South Side and in Brownsville neighborhood on 49th and Indiana Avenue. But we really like research as this way to understanding territory. We use a lot of maps, whether at large scale in parking lots of closed schools or in a cultural center like this one. This was a very interesting commission by the Department of Cultural Affairs, thinking about how do we unpack, how do we have these conversations and think about data that comes not only from the usual suspects, but and also not in the usual categories. So we try to expand a little bit the palette of questions and thinking of not only about the places, but let's talk about the people, let's talk about the types of programs, let's talk about other categories, and just became this constellation of data. At the end of the day, we really love working with data and representing data and thinking collectively around data in a different way. Can we go to the next one? But ultimately, it's about centering communities. And we really prioritize working with communities of color. As a woman of color, as a designer of color, as an immigrant, I think this is something that resonates often in our practice, and we try to be very intentional about it and really trying to lift and elevate the stories of communities. We have to invent our materials and we have to invent our tools to have these conversations, whether it's with residents in the community that have been there for a long time, or with the new generations that have a completely different ways of understanding their built environment and their capacity and their power to transform it. So sometimes it comes in the form of a game, sometimes it comes in a form of a workshop, sometimes it comes in a form of designing the program itself to have the type of conversation that we want. And we've been really lucky to work around the country. I think thinking of how our communities are changing, not only in terms of demographics, but also the different interests, the different tools, the different access to information, the different youth, the different young students, that residents that have been there for a long time are exchanging. And how do we think of the spaces? How do we think of the processes? How do we design all these things in a way that are responsive and not necessarily come from a template? So we try to think more of frameworks instead of plans or things that can be just replicated or transferred from one place to another. So really thinking of like, what are the values? What are the principles? What are the things that can structure the conversation and the work? But also, how do we make them memorable? How do we make them insightful? And how do we make them accessible and meaningful for the different publics that we work with? The last slide, I think it's this really beautiful view. I love this photograph. This is the same school. You can see the little orange color on the bottom left of the image. This is one of the closed schools that we've been working on the foreground. Architecturally very remarkable, but also we wanted to provide a different view and a different perspective from the South Side of Chicago. So a lot of our work in Chicago concentrates working with the South Side communities, and we really keep that in perspective, and we really want to elevate that work and make it visible, put these communities in the mental map of Chicago. So I put my timer. I think my 5 minutes are up. So
you nailed it. That was perfect. George, no pressure to set a timer. It's okay. Thrilled to introduce you next to George A., an old friend of mine as well, and co-founder and director of innovation of Greater Good Studio. The part of George's title that I appreciate the most is that he's a pissed off optimist, and I think that there are probably more and more of them these days than there were 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe not. I suppose you might know more than I do about that. Anyway, George co-founded Greater Good Studio to use design to heal, to be just, and to be restorative. Previously, he spent 7 years at global innovation firm IDEO before being hired as the first human-centered designer at the Chicago Transit Authority. Since founding Greater Good, he guides clients and teams through complex projects that honor reality, create ownership, and build power. So George, why don't you tell us what you've got?
Sure. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me here. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Tanner, for hosting. It's great to be amongst Paula and Chris, and just feel like, oh, I have like this is my crew. So I just have a couple of slides. I don't even think we'll take the whole 5 minutes. If we go to the next slide, I'll just sort of mention that we've been in Chicago now doing this work for 10 years. This is our 10-year anniversary, which is mind-blowing to us because we didn't think we'd get this far. But having now done this work, it's been about, I think, probably 150 engagements over that time. And the projects and issue areas that we've got to work on have really been pretty broad. probably to the point whereby we might start to wonder, like, what do we have a focus? And I think to a degree we do. There are certainly topic areas that we have a particular fondness for, but I think that the idea that we can work across these different topic areas is, I think, more testament to the flexibility of the design process as a whole. And I think the adaptability of design to work in complex social issues is kind of what we want to demonstrate. So it's always been very important to us to be able to kind of show how you don't have to be so tied to using design to produce software or physical products, which is kind of maybe the main two that most people associate. But actually, I think there's a lot of utility in thinking about design and design process in a lot of very deeply seated systemic issues, and many which are actually very much framed and controlled by the history of the context in which we do that work. And perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to just highlight two particular projects because we have a couple of different things going on at the studio at any one time. But if you go to the next slide, one in particular here that we mentioned is the one called Vision Zero that we're doing currently right now here in Chicago. So Vision Zero is an international movement. Actually, it's not just something that's certainly nothing to do with us per se, but actually it's a larger movement across multiple cities around the globe with a goal to eliminate death and serious injury from traffic crashes. And Chicago's commitment that has been going for a number of years through the Chicago Department of Transportation is to make streets safer for all road users. And our particular focus, geographically speaking, is in the Northwest side. There's been other Vision Zero efforts already done by CDOT here in town. So the neighborhoods that we're focusing on the Northwest side are Belmont Cragen, Humboldt Park, West Humboldt Park, and West Town. And then if you look at the next slide, is the other concurrent project we'd happen to be doing in town. It's called Imagine Just. So this was a little more complicated to explain because this doesn't kind of relate to other things happening other than, I'd say, just like a big groundswell of interest and conversation in this area altogether. So to describe it, it's a collectively led diverse coalition to build a just and equitable arts and culture ecosystem that radically centers Alana and BIPOC creatives and communities and intentionally advances all towards a liberated future. That is a lot going on in that sentence right there. But it's worth noting that both Alana and BIPOC are terms not everybody is that familiar with, and I'd say Alana is a little newer to me actually. But as it states in the graphic here, African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American, as well as BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The sort of, I think what's helpful to note about here is just the broadness by which we are describing the kinds of people that could be centered. And we do so because we're really interested in trying to work out, in this particular project at least, how to shift the focus of where arts and culture work typically happens, and the power structures that typically define how that work has typically been done, to, I think, really better map and represent the kinds of populations that really do exist here in Chicago. So I think that's probably under 5 minutes, but that's kind of what's going on with us at the studio these days. Thanks for having me.
You nailed it too. Absolutely. The bar is high, Chris. You ready? I know you are. I know you well enough. So thrilled to introduce you now to Chris Rudd, who's a designer, community organizer, and youth worker with a passion for social justice. Chris has worked with youth on the south and west sides of Chicago, challenging them to engage with their communities through activism and technology. Chris is the founder and lead activator of Shy by Design, where he focuses on empowering communities through human-centered design. He's also instructor and lead of community-led design for the Chicago Design Lab at the IAT Institute of Design. So with that, Chris, I'll pass it back to you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, awesome to be here with everyone and looking forward to a great conversation. We can get rolling. So Shy by Design started 3 years ago, really out of frustration with the design field generally. I started to see design thinking, human-centered design being implemented in the social space. And I thought that was great, but then when I would look at the design firms, it was typically white, typically male, with a sprinkling of other folks around. And the projects would be Inglewood, Roseland, Austin, blah, 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 all the Little Village, all the Black and brown neighborhoods. And it was just obvious to me that design teams and studios like that just could not understand that population, the problem, and therefore could not create the proper solution or intervention. And so started Shy by Design as a way to bring together Black and brown designers to start being able to address those bigger issues. So we go to the next slide. So this is currently the team. And when I started the firm or a studio, whatever, it was really about, again, how do we bring together disparate voices and designers to address these social problems. And so one of the founding principles was that the team would always be 75% people of color and 50% women. And that was based on understanding we can't design a future without those inputs because the present has been designed without them. And so this is how the team looks right now. And, you know, luckily we're still growing, and that principle will always be a part of our work. And so this is our core team. This doesn't even include the co-designers. Our approach to design is strictly co-design. So we don't design for anyone. And so we say caring, bold, and dynamic are what makes Shy by Design what it is. And so the care really goes into the creation of the team, how we hold each other in these spaces because we deal with very difficult issues. And also, how do we care for the co-designers that we work with who face trauma day in and day out? So if we go to the next slide, the boldness of our work is that we position ourselves as an anti-racist design firm. That is always our focus. Everything we create is to the intent of creating anti-racist outcomes. And so this is a research project we wrapped up last fall, identifying how racism impacts the Ohio child services system. So not just like what are the pain points in the system or the service, but specifically how racism harms Black, brown, indigenous children and families in their system. We're currently working with them to do part 2 of this project, which will look at entrance and experience while in the system, but specifically around racism. I was telling my team, one thing when we talk about bold, when we do our reports, I'm always pushing them to say what needs to be said. So if it's racist, say it. If it's sexist, say it. Don't try to dilute it. And so when we look back at our reports, you see the word racism so many times in each of our reports. And I think it's important that designers do that. The last slide, the last 2 kind of go together. This is a project around developing an equitable food system in Chicago. And so when we say dynamic, we don't position ourselves as a human-centered design firm. We think of ourselves as anti-racist and systems thinking. And so if you're going to do anti-racist design, it has to be multi-level work. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see this is how we start to develop infrastructure. So we're really focused on anti-racist infrastructuring that, you know, focus on this one says dismantling the control of wealth, land, power, which is currently controlled by those with wealth, and then reducing the impact of white supremacy culture on the food system. And so, you know, we are really focused on multi-level interventions that address racist inequities in systems. And that's it.
Thank you all so much. And thanks, Jeannie, for running the slides there. Jeannie and I have been talking a lot about the 3 of you over the last couple of weeks. If you felt your ears burning, that was why. And I think there are sort of a few common threads between you, 3 that stick out to me that I think you all 3 talked about this evening already. Research. I think research is very core to all of your practices. You're also all centered around communities, different communities, but also similar communities. And community seems to be very strong through all of your research. And then 3rd, you're all building systems instead of solutions. So to take that thread and thread the needle, I think all 3 of these attributes are super valuable, if not essential, to collections as well. Collections are centered around communities. They are centered on research, and they are systems instead of solutions. So I just wanted to kind of say that explicitly. Of course, my battery is going to die, so I'm going to go into the desk really quick and plug in. But before I do that, I've got my first question here is, and this is not a setup, I promise, but how are you archiving your work, your events, your history? And if you're not, that's okay too, but because I think a lot of us struggle with that. But how are you archiving your work?
And as we said, if you're not, we're here to help too. Chicago Collections is. So share with us. Have you thought about it for future generations, or what? Where are you with that?
Instagram.
I can go first because that's definitely one of my passions, documentation. I wouldn't put it in the category of archiving it, but like it's documented. We really think like how, and it comes from a value of generosity, right? If you want the work to be recreated, replicated, accessible, I think it's twofolded. One, we're elevating, or we're really intentional about elevating the stories of those who are part of the process. So the less that I have to talk about it, the better. So we do a lot of interviews, video. We've been using as media. We've been using a lot of videos. I'll share in a moment. Our Vimeo channel it's really been a wealth of going back to the stories, but also thinking over time. We've been doing our work with Close School, specifically with Overton in Bronzeville, has been going on for 5 years, and we've accumulated a number of stories, and we really think that's a really great kind of material to continue to elevate those voices, but also to think about, the change, the trajectory of the project over time, because, it's not always every year we do an open call, or there's different forms of partnerships and collaborations, and the dialogue and the conversations that are cultivated out of that are recorded and are, expressed differently. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I'm just, I'm a documentation junkie for the lack of a better word, but I really enjoy like capturing the work of others. I think this project, Creative Grounds, which is about the closure of nearly 50 schools in Chicago, for me has been fascinating, and thinking like how this is a collective effort. This is something that we're willing to start up, but are therefore creating its own website, therefore creating the resources that, right now they're only digital, but I think starting there is a really good way to think about this, resources. So archiving there the work that has been done over 5 years, I think that's been fascinating for me, and also a challenge, right? Because investment of time and energy and just content creation for that, it's a significant investment.
Or is there an intent behind it, or practice into it?
Yeah, no, there's no intentionality behind it right now. So it's like, yep, here's a link. Yep, here's the cover of a report we just did. Check it out. So yeah, this was the question. I was like, ooh, definitely not prepared on that front.
I thought I'd start with it. And George, is it kind of make you uncomfortable too? Are you doing any kind of?
Well, yeah, no, it's not. I don't. I'd have to come clean and say I don't know if we really know what we're doing in terms of archiving. Although the word archiving does make it sound very serious. I think what we have been doing, if I really had to look back, and there is some effort, was something that initially came to mind was actually the idea of called 101s, or Creative Studio 101s, as in like if you had to get an update on like what's been going on with us, there's been some effort towards it. We certainly are going through updates of what this 101 should be. In particular, we had some initial language. Actually, we had documentation of like what inclusive language we were using. And then we had a recent team member actually go through and look at it and say, this is actually fairly problematic how the inclusive language document that we were using as a 101 was very out of date, if only just because language updates so much faster than a method might. So we're going through a reboot of that right now. So that's been helpful. And it reminded me as I was thinking about, hey, where do we keep that? Oh, right, there's an internal site. So it turns out we have some efforts. It's not like it's been completely absent. And one thing that I think is really notable was something called an RFP library. So we were recording previous attempts at RFPs we've responded to. And that archiving has been helpful for us to kind of look back and go, how have we talked about this type of topic before? How have we approached this before? Or what standardized language were we using to describe our studio? So just having like a record of that has been helpful, but I don't think I wouldn't call it archival because that makes it sound so legit. It's more just been moments and attempts at trying to have some record of what we've done. Maybe the only other closest thing that kind of comes to mind was because of how everything has gone remote, and maybe we've been doing it a little bit before COVID, but almost every week or so, we have something called a BD charrette, where we look at all of the incoming business development and just like, how do we interpret this? And the idea that there might be a place for us to be able to put that recorded meant that we ended up having to do this almost like a gut check, respond to a series of questions that allow us to understand like, what is the nature of this incoming request? And all of those have been archived. And we go back actually several years because we had, we've I think up to version 5 of it now, where things used to be in a Google form. Now it's been more migrated to Google Docs. So there were, I don't know, a couple of close to maybe 100 of those. So I mean, I would love any help if anyone's offering. But if you had help, we have stuff. It's just kind of all over the place. And I think some structure that would probably help us a lot.
Jeannie, I think I saw your hand go straight up when he said, does anybody want to help?
Both hands too, because we're so busy in the now that to be able to capture the now and the great work that, that's why we brought you all together, the great work that you're not only doing for our city, but other cities, and how to preserve that to help future generations too. So.
And it's
I'm already working on the next program here, Tanner.
Oh, good. Excellent. Well, let's move away from the other questions are difficult as well, but maybe a little easier. Let's talk about history for a minute. And what role has history played in your work and the creation of your organizations, if any, I suppose?
I might just pick up on that and just mention how when trying to think through how that plays out, it's difficult to not be in Chicago and not actually still be feeling the echoes of major historical events. But actually most of the work, because it's so focused on the social sector, it's still dealing with ramifications from decisions from redlining to going back even further to sort of just a racist history of our country. That to do work in the social sector, how could they not be entrenched in historical decisions that have long-lasting effects that really reveal a lot of both the ways in which harm was perpetrated, but also on our own unwillingness to recognize the harm that was done then and is still happening now. So if we have, labels of projects from sort of enormous wealth gap that might exist around Black and brown communities compared to the white counterparts, and the ability for housing or houses to be a generational wealth mechanism, that those effects and those later stages of how those decisions we're still feeling now, and I think that might still then show up as almost project types. If we got down to sort of how design works, but if we go back further and further into history, you just realize, oh, those decisions that we're dealing with back then that are racist in general, how are they not still showing up today in the project that we do? So I feel like almost everything that we have as a studio is still rooted in historical echoes, I guess. And I think one of the challenges for us is to work out what is our proportional response. I don't know if I'd want to go as far as to say it's what equity would look like, because I don't know if we could even claim that we do equitable design. I think we look through a lens of equity for sure. But to say that our responses are proportional based on how past historical decisions were made and therefore the decentering of certain populations, I think those two would definitely be related.
Before we move on, if you're not doing equitable design, George, who is?
Oh goodness, I mean, I think there are those on this panel already who could speak to that for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard to say who is. I mean, I just don't know if I would be the right person to be asking on this topic area. I think there was a period of time when we thought we were, and I think we had some pretty frank conversations with our team members to work out what does that really look like. And I mean, I think there are those who make policy that can make and break, entire communities on decisions they make. That would be closer to equity and to power. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting with design we do is to work out who should we be centering as our clients. And I think that brings up another notion of who were we centering before? It's hard for me to think about this work, and I'm sorry to take up so much time, but there's a quote from a particular scholar that I reference a lot. His name is Tim Wise, and he spoke a little while ago and talked about the idea of underserved communities and the lack of really narrative around the flip side of that, which is the idea of overserved communities.
Mm.
And it would hard for me to think about design work and not think about who has designed typically overserved again and again and again and again. So if we are trying to work out who is being underserved, it's hard to not imagine who therefore has had, a disproportionate helpings. And it kind of motivates us to think, well, should we therefore not be trying to make up for that shortfall and do so with a level of care and respect and empowerment that was done to others? I think that that's a fairly strong argument for why we should exist. I don't know if you could say that is equitable, but I think that there is a component to it which is just trying to recognize how historically it has not been done. I'm like trying to, I wouldn't say backtrack, but just sort of be much more careful about how I use that language, because I think I've been careless about it in the past. And it's hard to know if I'll ever really get the feedback I need to know how to use it properly.
That makes good sense. Thanks for going a little deper there.
I appreciate that reflection, George. And it helps me to, a lot of my reference to history, especially in the context of Chicago, is through urban planning, urban design. So in the reflection that I make regarding to this idea of like what voices are centered, like who has a privilege, right, to center their perspective and decision-making process is very real, right? So the example I like to use, because it was very true for me in my education. In grad school, we all learn about Daniel Burnham and his beautiful, wonderful 1909 plan. But then, going later into investigating, like, were there no other perspectives? And when you're like trying to unpack the fact that it was supported by the Chamber of Commerce of the time, or like the capital perspective. So like you start questioning all these decisions that were done with like one very particular perspective, right? Putting Chicago in the map of the world, but then what was happening with other very localized and very important issues like socially. So started reading up Jane Addams, right? And there's this fascinating, I'm gonna recommend it to y'all. It's a fascinating book. It is called What Would Jane Say? And what the piece that was fascinating to me was a fictional letter written from Jane Addams to Daniel Burnham, saying something along the lines of, Mr. Burnham, we appreciate your plan, as if they had shared with them, and like, but we think it's missing this and this and this and this. And you can easily imagine what were the topics that she was bringing up, right? Like, where are the children? Where's the places for play? Where are all these things that now we think like we're innovating around those topics? And like, no, they were positioned from a perspective of immigration, right? Those were like things that were identified in a period of history where there was this cultural diversity emerging very strongly in the city, and reinventing public space, and reinventing social work, and reinventing the way that we cultivate relationships. So that story is not told like as strong as a 1909 plan of Chicago. So again, like, what perspectives and what histories are dominant in the way that we understand the legacy of the city? I reflect a lot about that, because, if someone like me who just, has been living in Chicago just for around 10 years, just gets this very narrow moments of understanding what has influenced the city, but you like repeatedly only listen to one, right? Like, you go to every exhibition and it's about Daniel Burnham. Probably didn't do it alone, but is a hero kind of positioning, right? So I just reflect a lot on that. And the work at the Whole House and Jane Addams was much more collective, and that's not in the same level of understanding and appreciation, at least from my perspective, in the work that we do. So we're trying to like shed light more in that kind of value system as a way to understand what histories have been privileged in terms of, visibility.
I think, I know history has absolutely influenced our studio, because it's influenced me in so many ways. And I think about yes, the inequities, the redlining, and right, we can't separate the past from the current context. But I'm also the things that I think influence me most are the activists who fought it. And so my real training, I think, design is like the second or third life of Chris Rudd, but the first two and continues is activism and organizing. And that history of Chicago is what influences my design work, which then therefore influences Shy by Design. So one guy who I think is most important to that is he's a Chicago. Well, he's not from Chicago, but made his career here. Was Lerone Bennett Jr. And Lerone Bennett Jr. wrote many books, but his understanding of race and racism is the most profound I've ever read. It has influenced my understanding of race and racism since high school, and it influences my design work. Right, it influences how we understand the context historically and the current context to then therefore start to design. But part of what I like about him, and in this picture, is actually a picture of him getting arrested, because he was not only a scholar, he fought for integration. So he got arrested in 1967. That's a picture of him getting arrested for fighting housing segregation. And so, one thing that I teach my students and try to, talk about within our studio is we have to be more than designers. It is not just about who we are professionally, it's what we do outside of our professional work that will then influence our professional work. It is those experiences that allow us to understand the world in a deeper way and to also co-create. If we're talking about, sharing power, we also have to share the burdens. And we can't understand really sharing power until we've been in the positions that the people we work with are in, right? And not in an analogous way, but literally being there with them in their struggles for justice. And I think to your question, Tanner, around like who's doing equity work, I don't think anyone. And I think it's impossible. It's not because they're not trying, but the paradigm in which we exist, in which we function, capitalism is based on inequity. So none of us are designing equitable solutions because that can't exist under this system. So this is why we say we're an anti-racist studio. You can be anti-racist. We can't have a race-free world under this system. And so, how do we create conditions for people to activate themselves in ways that resist the oppressions in which we are faced with?
I love that. Thank you so much. I see there's a hand up in one of the attendees. If you have any questions for now, drop them in the chat and we'll come back around 6:45, 6:50, somewhere around there. But leave your hand up and we can absolutely come around to you as well. I'll follow your lead on that, Jeannie. So we talked about the past, and I'm just going to jump into what I think is my biggest question is, one of the reasons that you study the past is so that you can reinvent the future. Where do you see Chicago in 5 years? And if that's too easy, where do you see Chicago in 50 years?
Oof. No easy questions here, Tanner. Thank you. I really enjoy what Chris is saying about you have to wear multiple hats, right? In order to understand, not only the impact of design, but like the ripple effects that your work can contribute to. So and it's hard because, we're human and we only have, the day still has 24 hours and we have limited capacity and whatnot. But I've been really invested in the past, just going a little bit of the past to the future. I've been really invested in, how do I grow myself in the world of equity and justice work. And I would challenge, to say there are organizations that are doing it very well in the city of Chicago. And that's where I've been really thinking about, like, there's the idea of frameworks is very powerful. right? Like how do we acknowledge our history? How do we think about shifting power? And I think that's very central, right? And that's where a lot gets, a lot of the work, it's very contested because we're so comfortable not sharing power. And then ultimately, how do you create systems of accountability, which is super hard again. But just to say that is, I've been really fortunate to be a fellow now for 2 years, a senior fellow with Chicago United for Equity, where we really reflect on this idea. Well, what is the future we want to look at? And it's a future that, all Chicagoans, it's a future that, your life expectancy is not dependent on the color of your skin or your zip code. And, it's access to resources, it's having everything you need within a 10-minute walk, like defining all these things, like how do our communities, what our communities need to be safe and thriving. So it's more about question positioning that making statements, and the answers become more of a collective exercise. But just asking the questions collectively for me is like a fascinating exercise. And, how do we work both with the immediate need and also be aspirational in envisioning? I feel like there's a lot of our work at Borderless is how do we reconnect with our capacity of imagining, especially in communities where harm and trauma is something constant, like your senses get numbed. It's almost an impossible task to imagine again. So how do we recover our capacity to imagine, and not only imagine as individuals, but imagine collectively a Chicago that works for all of us? That's a very kind of like layer answer, but I wanted to say, one, it's a collective future. So imagining individually for me doesn't make sense. And it's a future where everyone has the capacity to reconnect with their own power. In particular for me, and understand the power they have to transform their built environment. And I think that comes very clearly, especially working with youth, in understanding how their capacity of understanding their power is so different from ours, in this room, and how to nurture, how to cultivate, and how to elevate that capacity.
Chris, do you want to touch this one? I'm not sure if I want to go next after that, to be honest.
Sure. We just wrapped up a project around racially equitable resource allocation, developing a framework for leadership in the city. And the thing that stood out to me in doing that project, and so this gets to 50 years, there is zero will that I saw during that project to address racial housing segregation. And as long as there is zero will to do that, the future will be similar to the present. The inequities that our communities are facing right now will continue because they have the cover to do it. They might have, one, we're seeing gentrification heavily, right? And I think our field is being used a lot to enable it, right? Let's start making pretty spaces all of a sudden. I remember when 35th Street got its overhaul. My grandmother lived in Lawless Gardens on 35th and Rhodes. It was, no one wanted to go there. And I remember when they started doing the construction, and I said, damn, why the hell are they doing this? And then we were driving on the Dan Ryan Expressway one day, and I saw the IIT emblem get put on the overpass and the White Sox emblem get put on the, I said, oh, that's why, right? So I saw someone put in the chat that, was it something about 20 years, urban planners were 20 years ahead. Yeah, they planned the gentrification 20 years ago. So what we're doing in a lot of these places, unfortunately, is enabling it to happen. When we do these projects, I've seen, working with communities, they don't even want to engage because they know once the improvements come, they got to go. And this is where the infrastructuring has to take place. It's not just about pretty spaces. It's not just about, I wouldn't say equitable access, but increased access to services, it's what are the policies that once the transformation happens, allows these long-term residents to stay. There has to be a whole system of interventions that are created if we're gonna advance past where Chicago has held the record for most segregated city between us and Milwaukee for decades. I mean, right? Like it's not changing anytime soon. And so, you know, I think until we get very serious about addressing racial housing segregation, we're going to be right. I see Oakwood Shores just came into the chat, right? Until we get serious about that, and the leadership of the city gets very serious about it, we are going to be in the exact same place, but Chicago will be less Black. We've already seen the decline, and we'll see. It'll be probably less Latino, right? It will become a vastly different city than I grew up in.
It's hard to follow these two speakers. It's I think one of the challenges that I think we're noticing is both a really interesting tension between projects that are interested in doing this type of equitable work that reflects history, and then folks who are not interested at all. And I think that one of the things that's going to probably determine how things show up for the next 5 or 50 years, as Chris said, to be more similar to what we have now or radically different, is I think that tension between the exposing the fragility of the leadership that we know exists from the most powerful in the city, and then the growing sophistication of our clients who are really interested in doing things to be in a really new way. I can't talk right now. And you know that sort of tension between our clients who are starting to come to us, actually outright asking, how do we share our power, with those who are interested in sort of having a bit of a panic attack as to noticing how do we like stem the tide. And I think that tension between those types of clients is probably going to be a big determining factor on where the future of the city goes. I think what we are seeing is that it may not be possible to remain stuck. It may not be possible to sort of have seats of power where, without demonstrable ways in which elevated voices of people who have not been centered in the past, and then demonstrations of how those elevated voices turn into decision-making power, can go on for much, much longer. And I think that that's sort of the kinds of people that we're hoping to support in the work we do. But I think those individuals, those clients, are starting to get more power by doing work in that way. And I think that that's a fairly radical shift, not only just in Chicago, but probably in a lot of cities across the country. But there is going to be a diehardness. There's like a, dare I say, white knuckling of people with entrenched power, generationally or otherwise, who have held on to it for as long as possible. They will continue to do so. But I think 50 years is a pretty good span of time. There's a chance that we might start to overcome that death grip that we see some of the most entrenched, powerful individuals and organizations. But I'm very heartened by some of the folks that we get to work with on a fairly daily basis these days, where that awareness and that understanding of not only is it prudent to be more open to input from people who are impacted by major decisions around the city, but actually it's critical that we make decisions because we are still living with the echoes, like we talked about before, the echoes of those decisions from 50 and 100 years ago prior. So I think that what we're seeing is clients getting that both sophisticated in sophisticated awareness, and I think a growing sophistication maybe what to do against it. That does give me some hope.
I appreciate both sort of the realism and the optimism. I can see both perspectives, and it does feel like they're at odds sometimes, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a tough question, and it's one that I've been reflecting on as well. I would love to move into some audience Q&A here. Jeannie, are you able to unmute Karen? She's had her hand up, or they've had their hand up very patiently for a long time here. Otherwise, Karen, you can, oh, there you go, talking permitted. So Karen, you're free to talk if you'd like to ask a question. Otherwise, or in the meantime here, I'll ask one from the chat. So while Karen, I think while we try to get you mic'd up here, Rhonda Hardy has a question. I'm concerned about the large information, especially photos in our phones, not transferred into a document or anywhere where we can easily access them. How do we share these visuals with our children and later generations if it's lost on our cell phones? I think that's a very specific question, but I think we can broaden out and sort of look at just sort of how we're communicating with future generations. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? It's the challenge of our day, I think. And Jeannie, feel free if you have any thoughts on that too. Yeah, there are no easy answers for this one.
No, and I'm actually going back on the topic to what George, Chris, and Paulo had surmised, that it comes down to the active nature of all three of you in the work that you do, translating into that activism to make that change, to keep after it. And Chris, I mean, you nailed it when, being a designer is like your, kind of your third role in life, in many ways. So, I'm so appreciative of this opportunity to have this collective conversation this way, and share that information, because, we may not be here in 50 years and where that change, but the seeds and the hard work that all of you are doing, I honestly think is going to make a difference, and help somebody else make that change for future generations. And I appreciate your comments, Chris, too, on the reaching out. It's a bigger structure to make those big changes, and it's a big network, and it's very political, but how can we break that, and how can we move forward with that in mind? And it's going to take locked arms.
Yeah, and that leads directly into a question from Sudeep T, which is, how do we get involved in the Chicago activism scene? Where do we even begin?
I'm not trying to be flippant, so please don't take it that way. But they're not hiding; they are out. I think all of last year we saw the streets filled with young people fighting very valiantly. So, I think you can. It's almost like Chicago. You throw a rock and you'll hit an activist. It feels like, but I think there's just a lot of great groups popping up. If you're really thinking about like design activism, I love like Alt Space Chicago right now. I think they're doing amazing work to reimagine what like systems and especially like economic systems have to look like. If you want to think about like just on the ground, tear down the door activism, there's Good Kids Mad City. If you want to think about more education focused, Coco is great. I mean, like there's a lot. But yeah, they're looking for people to join. That's what activist groups are about. They're not exclusionary, hopefully. So they will welcome you. Don't be scared to reach out.
I think also, just complementing that is that activism is expanding the forms in which it gets manifested, specifically thinking like who leads the type of activism, right? Like young people are leading very different activism that, adults did in the past. And then the topics, right? Climate change versus civil rights movement, or like, I feel like I was reading a comment about like unity between Black and Brown communities, like there are different forms of activism that they're also ideas that are emerging as stronger as like forms of care, right? Community care and solidarity. And like, how do we rethink the frames in which we have been thinking for so long that are tied to capitalism practices, right? And then thinking, what is the what is the opposite of that, right? And what is solidarity and mutual aid and resilience and all these concepts that are emerging, especially after last year, right? Like we reconnected with all these concepts and ideas that they were very invisible, and then became the power and the core of a lot of the efforts, right? So that we saw gaining visibility. You know, a lot of these organizations had been doing their work for a very long time, yet last year was a really a shockwave that helped us to like reconnect with this, a lot of the work that they were doing. So I think, you know, like solidarity, I was thinking, Chris, when you were naming all these things like solidarity economy, like I love this organization called Cola Nut Collaborative that thinks about what if we think of like time banking as a way of, you know, as another form of exchanging time and resources. So I think there's a lot of new ideas, but also ideas that are being generated collectively. We've seen more like the collectives, the collaboratives as these forms of activism that are also around or interested in pushing or exploring what ways of community care are there to collaborate around in our community. So there are many levels. I think there's a lot. Once you scratch the surface, you start mapping them, and there, you know, it just depends on like in what topic, right, in what area. And I think that's where a lot of the work probably needs to be done. Like how those connections get made, because there's a lot of individual organizations effort, but there's not a lot of efforts kind of like networking and linking everything together.
I just want to do one quick shout out to the folks at JCUA, the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. I know my co-founder is now on their board, and I get through tangentially through some of the work that she's doing, just the efforts that they've been working on around public safety for years now. And I know the kind of the transformation they went from being a mostly Jewish focused organization to becoming much more social justice focused, and actually transforming their own internal mechanics and really all of their staff around organizing principles. So that's maybe something that folks can look into if they're just adding to Chris's list.
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate you all. I could listen to you the rest of my life. Can't wait to get on listening with you all again. Jeannie, can I give you the last word? Yes,
and I too am thankful for this opportunity. We had more questions, obviously, and not enough time as that goes, but I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation again, and we look forward to seeing what the three of you will be doing for years to come. So thank you.
After I said I would give you the last word, Jeannie, on that. But thank you so much, Jeannie, as well, for this opportunity. Thank you, Terra Foundation. Couldn't do it without you. I'm really thrilled to be part of the organization.